Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnny Gibbons, and I am the Senior Press Secretary and spokesman for the Smithsonian Institution. And I can say in that capacity that it is our pleasure to host this wonderful conference this weekend. And it is my personal pleasure to be the one chosen to introduce the moderator for this session, Rachel Gross. Rachel is the Smithsonian's online science editor at Smithsonian.com, where she manages the science section of the site, which receives more than 7 million individual views every month, large in part to Rachel. Before she came to the Smithsonian, she was already an established and very successful science reporter, where her work appeared in the very well-known media outlets such as NPR, National Geographic, and the New York Times. So if you all will join me in welcoming to the podium Rachel Gross.
Hey guys, that was pretty unexpected. I was going to tell you that I work at Smithsonian.com, which you might know for our live updates of what pandas eat and a lot of frog sex. And I'm a younger editor, so I'm actually extremely pleased and excited to be here to introduce this house of superstars. I call them the mitochondria of the science journalism world because they are powerhouses, and clearly you know that. So yeah, I mean, the fact that you're here already gives me reason for cautious optimism because it means you actually understand and are interested in the importance of communicating your work to journalists and the public at large. And that's enough to make my heart fill. So I wanted to do this panel because as a science journalist, I talk to a lot of researchers, and I realize we have so many misconceptions about what each other does, and often researchers, with some good reason, fear that we want to sex up or oversimplify their research or make it clickbait, or they just don't know how to get in touch with journalists and introduce their work, which is often great, and I really would like to cover. So I thought we could pull back the curtain and remove a little of the mystery and give you access to some of the best minds in the business who literally have been through thousands and thousands of pitches, often about conservation, and shaped some incredibly engaging narrative stories and kind of see how their minds work. So briefly introduce them and basically their names. Aha, cool. So Rhett Butler here, in order, is the founder and editor of Mongabay.com, a website that aims to raise awareness in wildlife and wildlands. He founded the site in 1999 and is the first journalist recipient of a conservation award called the Parker Gentry Award. Laura Helmuth is the Health, Science, and Environment editor at The Washington Post and the president of the National Association of Science Writers. She's been a senior editor at National Geographic, Slate, where she was my editor, Smithsonian, and, Science Magazine, too. Yeah. Ross Andersen is senior editor at The Atlantic, overseeing science, technology, and health sections, and he works on both the print and digital sides. Before The Atlantic, he was the deputy editor of Aeon magazine. And Rob Kunzig is the senior editor, environment, at National Geographic magazine, the author of the award-winning ocean science book, Mapping the Deep, and co-author of a book about climate science called Fixing Climate that was required reading in my journalism program. So I'll let them introduce themselves and just mention how they engage with conservation research and conservation stories and what their audience is. As I think, as you'll find, audience is one of the most key things to keep in mind with this kind of panel. So take it away.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm Rhett, and I run Mongabay. So Mongabay is probably the most specialized outlet here. We really focus on conservation, so environmental science and conservation is definitely our beat. We tend to be more international than domestic. And our audience is pretty broad. So we have different groups. So we have kind of the research community, conservationists, scientists. We also have a lot of policymakers. So we have a lot of readership in, say, the State Department, like the Indonesian government. So kind of these technical audiences. But then we also have mass market. So we tend to focus on certain topics, and then our audience kind of finds us. And so that's kind of our approach. But again, it's kind of like these different baskets.
Hey, thanks everybody for coming. So there are some more seats in the front, so feel free to come in and fill in there. And if you decide to leave in the middle of the talk, we won't be offended. So it's totally fine to stand up in a huff and go to another talk, because it's hard to know which panel to go to. There's so many competing ones. So I'm Laura Helmuth. I'm now the Health, Science, Environment editor at the Washington Post. And so the Post, we have a new goth motto, as Rachel calls it. Our motto is "Democracy dies in darkness." So we basically want to expose things that perhaps politicians or businesses or other things don't want exposed. We have 7 or 8 different ways to share information anonymously through Secure Drop and Signal and things like that, if anybody ever wants to leak to us. So our audience, science is a big part of what we do, but the bigger part, of course, is politics. And so the Post historically covered Washington, D.C. as sort of a company town, covering the federal government, all the agencies, House, Senate, Judiciary. And we've sort of expanded beyond that, and now are thinking more nationally and internationally. Just in the past few years, we've gotten more ambitious. We've staffed up. We're doing a lot more, and doing a lot more with science and a lot more with conservation, locally, nationally, and globally. And so there are a lot of different ways to place stories in the Post, and I'll talk about that in the next section. But we're very interested in being on top of what's happening in conservation.
Hi, I'm Ross Andersen from The Atlantic. The Atlantic is a general interest magazine, as you may know. We think of ourselves as a magazine of ideas, but we also, I would say, are relatively politics-focused, which puts an extra burden on me in editorial meetings to pitch science stories as interesting for the general reader. I would say we have a slight intellectual tilt, although you would not know it from our comment section. If you ever make it down there, I try not to. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to taking your questions and seeing your perspectives a little later.
Hi, I'm Rob Kunzig. I'm the environment editor at National Geographic. I'm a word person at a photo magazine, and that says a lot about what I do. National Geographic is a very general interest magazine. We have about 4 million readers in the U.S., 6 million worldwide. We have 40 translated editions, and that's a big part of our audience now, and that has a big effect also on the kinds of stories we do. I spend part of my time now editing news features online, but still most of my time working for dying old print, but which keeps surprising us by how well it keeps going. So, and it's still paying the bills. So I can talk a little more later about how we pick stories especially for the print magazine.
Awesome. So I'll just get you guys thinking for a couple slides, and then basically they're going to give us some of their best tips for researchers, what they're really looking for and what works for a conservation story for those very different publications, and maybe a few things that they really hate that they get from researchers if they feel like it. So I thought I'd just start. This is my dad's sign for the March for Science. My dad is a retired theoretical physicist, as you can probably tell by this terrible sign. I love him, but objectively, factually, this is awful. He explains like the greenhouse effect, and it's like 3 signs in one. And I think this is a classic example of misreading your audience. So, he's used to teaching physics classes. That's what he did for 20 years. Maybe talking to scientists. If you're at a march and people are just going to see your sign walking by, they have 3 seconds, you need to just stop them where they are. This is not going to cut it. The acid green 90s internet aesthetic aside, awful. And yeah, I feel bad because I'm an editor and it should be better, but it's hard to edit your immediate family. So the thing he should have put on there was the first thing he told me when he heard about the march, which was, Rachel, alternative facts are lies. His opinion, not mine. But you need to hook your audience, get their attention, and then you can come at them with the evidence and the story you have, I think. So I gave a workshop to some natural history researchers recently, and this is kind of how we think in the newsroom and other places I've been. If you're at a cocktail party, we want to be your most interesting and well-informed friend. What are you going to lead with? So if you meet me, you're going to tell me that you work on barnacles, or Are you going to tell me that you discovered the first barnacle to make lasers? That one. So think about starting with your lead. How are you going to connect it to my daily life? What sparkling fact are you going to lead with? So what we're always asking ourselves at Smithsonian, which is going to be different than these publications, and we do a lot of daily science, a lot of study coverage, but I think these are pretty general. So like, why should your reader, living their daily life, drinking their coffee and scrolling through their phone, care? Why is it relevant to their daily life? Why is it significant, or what's the larger impact? What's the story behind the study? If you have a personal connection or there's an interesting way you came up with the question, we really want to know that, and that's not in the journal article at all. If it's basic research, can you talk about potential applications? Even if you're speculating, and please make it clear you are, we will mention that, but we want to know the potential and how it would get people excited. And then for us, Johnny was really kind about our traffic, which actually is over 9 million a month. But it's not me. It's Nazi gold, dinosaurs, and fossilized poop. Those are things that our readers really love. We know our readers well. They're very quirky. And if I see that in your research, then I'm interested in covering it. So know your audience, again. Yes. So, yeah. I also wanted to mention that, like, I think that we really respect scientists, and you're clearly the masters of your scientific domain. We respect your expertise. You know everything about the sexual habits of the barnacles that only exist in tide pools in Monterey. And we don't want to dumb down your research. We don't want to turn it into clickbait. We want the specific stories with all their nuance and complexity and richness and caveats. And the difference for us is framing, like my dad's sign. You're the experts in your subject. We know how to tell a story pretty well, usually. A couple pieces of wisdom I'll leave you with. Ross said this at a science writers meeting. Editorial talent distilled is being easily bored, which was brilliant. And that's actually from his writer, Heather.
Yes.
Heather, whose name is hard to remember now.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's Heather Havrilesky. I always have to credit her with that.
Yes.
Theory.
Yeah, got to cite where it's due. So it's not that anyone's research is boring, which my co-editor reminded me to say to researchers, since she has a PhD in chemistry, and she's like, don't tell them they're boring. It's really condescending. I'm like, yes, it's not that. It's more that there's intense competition, and like really we do come across 100 pitches a day, and we meet a lot of really fascinating, great researchers, and we have to make hard decisions about what to highlight and what stories to tell. So kind of keep that in mind. Don't want to put pressure on you, but there is an elevator pitch and a lead that you want to start with. And the other quote that I always remember is Joel Achenbach, a science reporter at the Washington Post, was talking at a conference, and it's my favorite audio clip of him ever. He's talking to a zoonotic disease expert at a zoo about whether a disease could jump from animals to humans. And the expert keeps talking to him in kind of science jargon and words that are not going to translate well to radio. And he finally is like, just tell it to me like I'm the drunk guy at the bar. Like, I'm interested, but I have no idea what you're talking about, and you need to hold my attention. Like other versions are telling me like I'm 6 years old. So you need to start that way to give them a window in, and then we can get into the details, basically. So I will start you off with that, and I will let these editors take it away, actually, on what they're looking for in a great story and how you can be that story. Cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. There you go. Cool. All right. Well, thanks again for having me. So I have a few tips for if you're trying to get a hold of someone at Mongabay or just generally for getting journalists' attention. First, journalists are really busy. I'm sure we're all really busy, but journalists are also constantly being bombarded by pitches and angry editors and all sorts of other issues that are sort of unique to the space. So it's really important to make it easy for journalists to cover your research. So really helpful. A lot of journalists, well, not journalists here, but I mean, just generally, a lot of journalists will work off a press release as a kind of a starting point or something that gets their attention in the first place. So if you can, it's important to develop a press release for your research. So whether you do that yourself or whether your institution does it, it's super helpful for a journalist as a starting point. It's good to include quotes that people can understand, so non-technical. So again, explain it to me like the drunk guy in the bar sort of thing. Putting it in context, so why does this matter? Why do we care about this barnacle being discovered? Maybe there's the health aspect, or it's some sort of thing on ship transportation, something like that. You should also always think about your audience. So who is the journalist you're pitching? Do they write about your kind of work? Do they care about it? But also think about who reads that publication. Especially now with social media and so much being on the internet, it can be very helpful to think about photos and graphs and things like that to illustrate your work. So if you come to a journalist with some really amazing photos, sometimes they'll say, okay, well, I'm not. These photos are amazing, so I need to figure out a way to sort of generate a story around this. So it can really help you if you come with additional collateral beyond just handing a scientific paper to somebody. And also, again, this is making life easy for a journalist. If you're sending an email or something like that, include a citation for your work so they can find it. Second thing is being responsive. So it's really annoying if I'm contacted by a journalist or contacted by a researcher and I want to do a story, but then the researcher doesn't respond to me. So the researchers who often get a lot of press coverage are people who are very responsive and they know how to communicate in non-technical ways with a scientist. And so that means being ready for comment, providing a copy of your paper, again, putting your research in the broader context of why it matters. And again, just as a reminder, journalists are very busy. Journalists also don't necessarily have full control over what they're publishing. They often have to sell their story to an editor. So you could have a great story. The journalist could be really into your story, but the editor doesn't care. So you can get 2/3 of the way there, but then it won't get published because the story hasn't been sold to the editor. So think about what you can do to help that journalist sell your story to an editor. And the third thing is being proactive. So again, there's being communicative, but being proactive is easier these days than it used to be. So essentially becoming your own media machine. So blogging about your research, talking about why it's important, using social media. But as you all probably know, social media you have to use carefully because it's really easy to destroy your career with a single tweet if you don't think about it. So just be careful. Try not to say stupid things. That said, some people have made careers out of saying very provocative things. So just think before you tweet. I think that doesn't necessarily apply in politics, but I think it's important in science. Highlight your own work. Try to be relevant. So if there's some major thing happening in the world, some news story or a major new study coming out and it's not yours, you can still be a resource because often a journalist will look for a second comment from an outside party, or there's an earthquake in Haiti and they want to know about earthquakes, and so you can be there if you're blogging or putting information out there. A journalist might reach out to you as being an expert on the issue. Taking photos is great. I mean, it's not a requirement, but again, photos go a long way in pitching a story for a journalist, pitching a story to an editor. And then you can also be proactive in reaching out to journalists. But don't be offended if they don't get back to you. We try to do our best, but again, it helps if you make a really compelling pitch to the journalist. They'll be more likely to get back to you. So I was asked to talk about a story that worked. This is a very extreme example. I'm not saying that this is like normal, but I find that sometimes taking an extreme example is a good way to illustrate something. So a few years ago, I was monitoring a publication in Portuguese, and they had talked about this phallic-looking animal that they had found in the Amazon. And I thought, wow, that is a very phallic-looking animal. And so I wrote a story that I called Penis Snake, note the parentheses, discovered in the Amazon is actually a rare species of amphibian. And so the purpose of doing this story was actually to highlight dams. Right, it's not even a snake. So it was to highlight the dams that were being built in the Amazon. So this creature was discovered because they had blocked out the river, so the riverbed is exposed, and there were a few of these flopping around at the bottom. And so When this story went viral all over the internet, everyone mentioned the dam. So I hijacked the story. I mean, normally it would have been just about this phallic-looking animal, but instead, Fox News, CNN, they all mentioned the fact that these dams were being built. So that was really the story, but the lead was this phallic-looking creature that, by the way, is a meter long and had only been found once before 3,000 miles away. So this is a very interesting creature to begin with. But we subsequently have done over 100 plus stories on dams in the Amazon and gotten, so we've gotten a lot of mileage out of sort of this initial attention. Sorry about that. So again, this is kind of an extreme example, but it's kind of a way to think about these things. It's, how can I talk about my research in a way that's engaging to the public? So again, I leave you with the penis snake. So.
That is the perfect story. Anyhow, I'm going to have a hard time topping that. So quick question, who here has written for the public before on a blog, magazine, news, anything? Oh, excellent, good. Who's active on Twitter? Anybody? Great. Anybody been on Reddit? Great, okay, excellent. Oh, you guys know what you're doing. That's great. I'm glad to hear that some of you are already engaging. It's fun. Twitter, so not to completely contradict everything you said, but journalists sort of live on Twitter, and journalism Twitter and science Twitter are kind of the two best classes of Twitter, and they're hilarious, they're fun, they're outrageous. It's if you're not much on Twitter, I encourage you to play around on it. It's a really good way to communicate with journalists and get noticed by journalists. So I'm all for it. And Reddit, if you ever have a paper coming out, doing an Ask Me Anything on the Science Channel is a really good way to sort of to reach a big audience, and also to find out what sort of questions people have. So if you're not familiar with this, an Ask Me Anything is you basically just contact the person who runs the Reddit Science Channel, who's a great guy. Tell them you've got this coming out, you'd be willing to do an AMA, and then they'll set you up for a time, and then several hours before it's announced, or a few days before, and then people just ask questions on Reddit, and then you answer them in real time. And it's a very democratizing process. A lot of people on Reddit are interested in science but don't know any actual scientists, and so this is a good way to kind of meet a new audience and a new conservation-minded audience. But specifically for the Post, as I mentioned, we've got this motto, democracy dies in darkness. We're very interested in exposing things. And what we really care about most of all is what we call accountability journalism, which is whose fault is it? What went wrong? Whose fault is it? How can we fix it? Who needs to fix it? Those kinds of questions. So we also love, straight news stories, straight feature stories with charismatic megafauna and penis snakes. But the angle of this also, the ecological destruction of this dam, the penis snake, making that more relevant is the angle that would appeal most for the Washington Post. So that's something we really care about. Let's see. Just click down.
Yeah, all right, nice clicker here. So here's the accountability story.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. So like I say, whose fault is it? Who can fix it? And part of the reason this works, because it's our mission, but also because outrage is useful. Getting people mad about something is a very good way to make a story interesting to people and make people want to share the story, and especially. But outrage by itself is unsatisfying, is upsetting. And so the perfect story, in keeping with the theme of this whole meeting, is if there is some sort of solution, if there's some sort of hope, if there's some way to fix a problem that's been identified, or if the problem's been identified for a long time and there's a new way to fix it, those are things that are a very good way to get attention for your work or for work that you care about. And so just one example is we had a whole series of stories about the opioid epidemic, which it's really just hard to overstate how horrible this is, how many people are dying of heroin overdoses, fentanyl overdoses. The numbers are just, from your perspective, just shooting up and have surpassed deaths by gun, deaths by car accident. It's just this horrible public health tragedy. And so we had a series of investigations of, people should have stopped this and didn't. And part of it is it looked like the DEA slowed down enforcement while the opioid epidemic was really bubbling up. So that's one issue. And so in general, framing, another tip, So for the Post, generally, people who wake up in the morning thinking, I want to read about conservation, they have a lot of places to go, and the Post isn't necessarily one. It wouldn't be the first thing you think about when you think I'm looking for environment, conservation, earth stories, and yet we reach a huge audience. And so part of the way to do that is to find some element of the story that's surprising, outrage. Like I say, outrage is good. And also if there's a travel, history, art angle, and this is something that Smithsonian's really good at too, and National Geographic, is if this story is happening someplace people ever go for vacation, that instantly means that you've got a larger potential audience. If there's some historical angle that grabs people, and for us especially, is there a political angle? And as I think everybody will say, as we're all text people, we all care about words, but really, if you want to grab people, the video, the photos, the graphics are what do it more than anything. So this is, as I mentioned, charismatic. Well, this is a kind of a medium-sized fauna, but we had a series of stories about the Fish and Wildlife trying to save black-footed ferrets by using a drone to shoot out, like basically Reese's Pieces that had been infused with a vaccine against a rodent plague to prevent the black-footed ferrets from getting it, and also their prey species, the prairie dogs, from getting it. So cute story. We had video. It did well. And then another thing that really matters for most journalists, and especially for news journalists, is we want to have an exclusive. So if you have a story that hasn't been covered and should be covered, that's a really good way to sell a story to journalists in general, and especially to newspapers. And one thing to keep in mind, so I run the Health, Science, and Environment desk, but there are other places in any major newspaper that also cover conservation, including education divisions. So look for education reporters, look for metro reporters in your area, also opinion pieces. So I edit a lot of scientists and conservationists and doctors. We run a lot of first-person stories. They tend to do really well. People like to hear first-person stories. So if you want to write it yourself, you can, or you can suggest that. But also just let us know, what's coming up, and kind of keep in mind that there are lots of different ways to tell a story, even in one publication. And if you're at an institution, as Rhett mentioned, do talk to your public information officers. They can really help get a message out, especially if you have a new paper coming out, or if a new field season, or something that's could be sort of newsworthy. And just one thing in general, notice, read lots of media and notice which reporters you respect, which ones get the stories straight. And if there is one who's doing work that you really admire and trust, if you have a good story, come to them first and tell them why that you're coming to them. And most of us, like at the Post, everybody has underneath their byline, they have their email address. And reporters tend to be easy to find, or ping them on Twitter. And that's probably the best way to make a direct contact. Because journalists, I used to be a scientist, now I'm a journalist. It's like it's very complementary worlds, complementary subcultures. So they're good people. They'll want to hear from you. Thanks. Yeah, I got it.
Cool. Just clicker.
Click right. There I am. All right. Hello. Rhett and Laura really covered everything, so I don't have much more for you. No, I'm going to try to focus on framing issues that are specific to the Atlantic. But before I do that, I want to echo what Laura said about Twitter. I have found so many stories for our writers and for myself by eavesdropping on researchers talking to each other, and talking to each other with the sort of compression and frankness that comes with Twitter. It's one of my favorite places to be during the day, and so if you're not on there, get on there and please follow me. First thing, in terms of what we're looking for, and I've got kind of some do's and don'ts that aren't organized in that way, but just happen to be do's and don'ts. And I try to tell people to avoid one-dimensional stories that simply say a bad thing is happening. I think that's actually true for a lot of publications, but it's particularly true for ours because we do consider ourselves a magazine of ideas, which means we kind of want to illuminate the world for people and not just sort of point to a particular bad phenomena, but try to highlight all the forces that are contributing to that happening and potential solutions and that sort of thing. So when researchers come to pitch us a story, or more frequently pitch one of our staff writers or freelancer a story, we really want them to kind of try to sketch the wider world around this. And I'm going to talk about, should I skip forward to, or we'll do it at the end. I'll give a particular example of this. Secondly, and more narrowly, frame things in terms of the Anthropocene when it comes to conservation stories. I know that there are all kinds of problems with that as a concept, and I think many people have suggested it should be called a Eurocene or a white manocene, and I think that's entirely fair.
Do you want to define it briefly for them?
Yeah, so the Anthropocene, as I suspect you'll know, is this idea that we've entered this new age of humans. And what that means is, to me anyway, is that we have to start making all kinds of choices, that we have to acknowledge that we are kind of the dominant power on planet Earth, especially when it comes to conservation issues. And so these stories, we have to sort of decide what's important to us now. And we're really looking for that, for people who are looking at the hard reality of what it is going to mean for the biosphere to coexist with the human sphere, or something like that. Another tip, don't be jaded about the media. We really are trying to help, and I know, as we said earlier, there are lots of reporters that will oversimplify a story, and that is bad for sure and can lead to bad outcomes. But they're usually doing that partly out of the nefarious motive to get more clicks, but also because they want people to look at your research, and they usually know a bit more than you do about how to get people to look at your research. They know, for instance, that a penis snake will win every time. So try, I understand caution in dealing with reporters, but we're all on the same team. And secondly, if you are particularly worried about how your research might be misconstrued out in the public sphere, go ahead and articulate how people have screwed up in the field in the past. I know some of the best education I've gotten talking to researchers have them being like walking through very carefully what it is that people have gotten wrong about their research, their field, or common misconceptions in the public. That's tremendous, and that helps everyone. Don't automatically, and Laura talked about this a little bit, but don't automatically assume that our reader shares conservation values. The Atlantic, in particular, is, I guess, a kind of center-left publication, but we started with this kind of ethos of no party or clique, and we do try to at least appeal to the center-right. And so, there are kind of touchstones in the conservation world. Sometimes I think that the conversation inside the conservation world really assumes a set of values that are not necessarily universal. So at the same time, and this is why I included this, number 5 here, no need to sort of strain to make a very tenuous case that this, whatever the conservation program or initiative is, benefits humans directly by like 5 degrees of separation. Like if it's just the case that we think we should live in a world where elephants live, and that is the case for doing it, be open about that and say that. Finally, I'm going to end with just a couple examples. This, I think, illustrates 2 things. This story was written by a young writer named Joshua Sokol about Florida's panthers and the very sort of Anthropocene dilemmas they face. And just to both Laura and Rhett's point about images, and Rob is really going to bring that home point forcefully for us in a minute when he talks about National Geographic stories. But when the writer pitched this to me, and he's a very talented young writer, and so I was already excited to get an email from him, but he included this photo in the email, and I was like, that's irresistible. That's going up top. We have this very cute panther with an oxygen mask on. I immediately want to know what's happening to this panther. Is he going to live? Et cetera, et cetera. But also, this is if I recall correctly, like a 4,000 or 5,000 word story. It's a pretty in-depth feature. And it is really wonderful for how it articulates all the problems that these big cats are facing without making easy villains of people. I know, like for instance, I have small children, and I really don't want large cats in my backyard where my children are playing. Like that's there's nothing wrong with that impulse in people to be, say, afraid of large predators, but then also to want to save large predators. And that's a hard problem that we all are in the process of thinking through. And I think this writer did a really good job, and the researchers are doing a really good job in trying to tease that out. And then finally, similarly, this is a story by one of our stars, our star science writer, Ed Yong. Do you all know Ed Yong? Clap. Yay! All right. I have to, when I go to the office, I'm going to tell him that happened. So, anyway, this is a sad story. This was based on a new report that had very bad news for giraffes. But what distinguished it was that, again, he was able to layer around the story and explain all of the contributing phenomena and all of the reasons that giraffes are just really, really tricky for us to keep around in our modern industrial society. And it's also just a really spectacular piece of writing, which is very important to us at The Atlantic. But if you get a chance to read it, check it out.
Yeah. I'll tweet out all these example stories afterwards and leave my Twitter handle. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Clicker right there. Just go right. Yeah, that one.
Okay. All right. You've gotten a lot of excellent advice, which is fortunate because I'm generally pretty terrible at giving advice on this sort of thing. I'm also terrible at Twitter, so if you would write to me, which I would very much like, please teach me how to respond to you first without responding to the universe and all those poor people out there who are following me expecting that I'm going to tweet one day. So I work for a print magazine. I've been doing this a long time. I've been at Geographic for 8 years now as the environment editor. I was a science journalist covering everything from astronomy to zoology for about 20 years before that. And still, frankly, when I look for stories, what really excites me about stories is still just the ones that tell me something really new and surprising about how the world works. It's the basic science, even in environment stories. So I think there's, somewhere deep in my DNA is something that forbids me from thinking that the world is going to end in catastrophe, and I just can't persuade myself. So even when I'm writing about these urgent stories or editing, as I do more often, the urgent stories that have to be told about what's happening to the world out there, I'm looking for some little clue about how the world works. So if I'm writing a story about how the Antarctic ice sheet really seems like it could collapse a lot faster than we thought. What I really remember learning when I did that story was this new mechanism about how as the West Antarctic ice sheet retreats down its basin, the cliff of ice gets larger and larger, and suddenly that cliff of ice becomes unstable and it could collapse really fast. And I thought, wow, that is cool. Oh no, it's actually a catastrophe. I shouldn't be excited about it, but the fact is, it is kind of exciting to me. So I look for stories that tell me something new like that. I look for stories that tell me not just how the world is, but why it is. So stories that give me a long historical arc. And especially at Geographic, we're looking for stories that help us understand other people, including people who are, maybe not so good for the environment right now. Why do they do the things they do? Why do they think that way? And this is very much agreeing with Ross. At Geographic, we are, like at the Atlantic, we're still in the somewhat precious treasure of having an audience that does not fall in one line. We cut across lines, and every time you write an article about climate, you realize that because you get a lot of mail telling you just how misguided you are to think that it isn't a hoax. But that's a good thing. We are talking not just to the converted. We are talking to a broad audience, and it's a global audience. And stories that offer hope. Well, hell, we all want that. Okay, so Geographic is a photography magazine. The director of photography tells me that all the time. Why don't I get that? If I want to propose those stories I'm proposing, why don't I go work for the Atlantic, for God's sake? Then I wouldn't have to suggest stories that can be photographed. So if you have ideas that you think might be good for Geographic, that's fantastic. You don't have to send the pictures. We're going to do the pictures. We're going to spend a year doing the pictures. But the story has to be susceptible to having a real visual narrative, which means it has to have variety, unless it's about a lion or some amazingly charismatic animal, in which case we'll run 20 pages just of pictures of that beast. But if it's any other kind of story, there needs to be variety to it. So, for instance, I'm trying to get a story on air pollution in the magazine. Global air pollution seems broad, right? I've got to convince the photo editors, air pollution, what are we going to show? We're going to show people with masks, and then what's the second photo? I said, well, no. I mean, I think we'll get it. We'll get there, but it's that kind of thing. They've got to be able to see variety and an interesting narrative. Places were, of course, since we're going to be taking these pictures, it's a very place-based narrative we do, but it has to be a place that has some global resonance. We can't get too local. It can't be, we get innumerable suggestions for stories on the latest mine that's going to rape the latest part of the earth. Or the latest dam that's going to destroy some valley. We do those stories, but we do them when we think they have some particular global resonance. So, for instance, we do a story about damming the Mekong River because it really presents, first of all, because it's a uniquely large and until recently mostly undammed river, but also because it presents this global challenge that people in developing countries face of needing to get clean energy, but while also trying to preserve the nature that they still have. And that is one of the universal challenges of our age. So those are the kinds of things we're interested in. And finally, I work at, National Geographic is really kind of a strange organization. I mean, I work at the magazine, but the magazine is part of a larger organization, which is also a conservation organization. It's also a science organization. And so we wrestle with this question of message versus story. We have a message, we have certain messages we want to get out, but I'm a journalist. I'm not about getting out the message. I'm not about getting out your message, even if it's a message I deeply believe in. I'm really about reporting what's happening in the world and telling a good story. And so, I don't know, maybe this will come up in the discussion, but more and more these days we talk about what's the right way to message? What's the right way to frame a story so that it'll have the impact? We're even doing scientific research on how best to do that. And something about that always makes me really uneasy because I feel like that's not quite really what the journalist's mission is. So an example of a story that I liked recently is this one about Manu National Park in Peru. So this is one place, but it's a pretty special place. It's one of the most diverse parts of the planet, biodiverse parts of the planet. These are Matsagenka, members of the Matsagenka tribe looking on at the Manu River, and that's their pet spider monkey. And so the thing that's really interesting about this place, we did a year-long series on parks, and this was the article where we were trying to get at the whole issue of what is the relation between people and parks, and especially between people who live in parks. In this country, as you may know, we solved that problem where we had people living in places like Yellowstone that we were going to make a park. We kind of booted them out. Well, in Manu National Park, there are indigenous people who have been living there for a long time. And they even hunt monkeys. And so the story started with that scene of going monkey hunting with these people. And so this is an example of you read that and go, monkeys, why? That sounds terrible. But actually, where you came out to, if you followed this story, first of all, you understood who these people were, what the history of this place is. This is the southern boundary of the park, the Alto Madre de Dios River. you came away understanding that maybe these people are actually protectors of the park. They don't kill a lot of monkeys. They've been doing it for a long time. They are actually, and they think of themselves, and they actually are a part of the natural system. Now, not everyone agrees with that. We quoted people in the story who say, it would really be better if there were no people in the park at all. So that's the tension, and that's an example of this kind of global issue that when we do a very place-based specific story like that, we're trying to get at. And so here's a pretty picture of an ocelot. And this is Yoina, who has a saddleback tamarin on her head. Her pet. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our speakers for giving a little insight. We'll hold the applause, though. So obviously it takes longer than an hour-long presentation to kind of get into journalists' heads and what they're going through, but I think this is a really good example of some of these heady and abstract debates and framing that journalists are thinking of when they come across your research. So things like humans' relationship with nature and holding power accountable, and how you can hunt threatened species and still protect ecosystems. Or maybe they're just thinking about penis snakes. But I think that, as Laura said, even though we don't always see eye to eye, I think we're very complementary. We don't want to be necessarily parasites, more like the helpful bugs that clean your teeth and make you shinier and more productive, or maybe the penis snake for your dams. I'm going to open up to questions, and feel free to mention specifically if you have a question for a specific editor, and you can use the mics. Go up to the mics. Yeah.
And there's lots of room up front if anybody wants to move.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate what Ross had said about addressing inaccuracies and how to work with journalists on that. We deal with that a whole lot where I work. And I was wondering, in the case
Where do you work?
Smithsonian Environmental Research Center.
Cool, thanks.
And we have had journalists get things wrong in the past for our stories because we know you're all under very tight deadlines and you don't have time to be experts in every single field. So one thing our scientists will offer to do is fact check sections of a story, not to doctor quotes, but simply to make it more accurate. But many editors are understandably leery of that because they don't want journalists or scientists putting a spin on a story. So is there any way to kind of soothe any editor's fears about having a scientist fact check a story or parts of a story, or is there a better way to approach that?
Is that for me or?
Anyone?
She name checked you.
I have to say, I work with editors that take a really hard line on that, and I understand all of the journalistic ethical reasons for doing that. The practice that I have is that I will let my writers send paragraphs, let's say, parts of a story to a scientist to verify on the condition that I see the correspondence, and so that I can understand what, if any, changes are being made. And so if you ever find yourself in a position, not to sandbag my fellow editors here, where you can point to that practice as maybe a middle ground, that might be helpful.
Can you explain what is the editorial fear? That seems like a journalist thing that maybe we wouldn't know about.
Yeah, great point. So the fear is that that the expert who is a source is going to introduce their own agenda, sort of snuck through the back door of fact checking, and so we want the story to be by the journalist who's coming to it with an independent frame.
The ultimate solution, if I may suggest that, we at the print magazine, National Geographic, we spend an enormous amount of time fact checking, and so we employ people for that purpose who spend, theoretically a month fact checking a feature article, but it just takes too many resources. So those people are actually being laid off, and in digital, the resources just aren't there. So the solution is for everybody to pay $100 a year for every website they like. And then we could, well, you know, it's really, is that fair? Am I being unfair? I think it's a matter of resources. We don't, so that's the kind of stuff that gets cut in the.
But one thing everybody can do is if you ever see an inaccuracy in a story, just let the writer know and they'll correct it immediately. So obviously once it's in print, you can't do that. I mean, we do run corrections, like in the Washington Post, we'll run a correction the next day. But most of the audience for anything that you read is going to be an online audience, and we can fix it. So
Yeah,
I mean, it's not perfect, but I think a lot of times people will be like, oh, why even bother? But we really want to fix it. We want it to be right.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean, our goal is to have accurate information, so we're interested in correcting any mistakes.
Hi, my name's Jade Lovell. I'm the host of the science channel SciQ on the TYT network. This is a question for all of you. I noticed that there's a lot of beautiful pictures of animals and stories about charismatic megafauna. What if you're trying to raise awareness or get a story across that's about an organization? I know a lot of people here are working with organizations that don't actually cover anything to do with animals. So that angle is automatically out. So imagine it was, say, the Nobel Prize for the environment. So it's newsworthy. There's news, a new thing that's happening, and that there's a prize. What would you suggest as an angle for a story? I'm kind of cheating by asking you what would be relevant to you as a pitch. What would be a way of making that sort of thing newsworthy that would appeal to you for your publications?
So are you, just to make sure I understand, so there is a prize?
There's no Nobel Prize for the environment,
Yeah.
so it's theoretical.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So, but that's sort of it. If there isn't an interesting animal, an interesting human would be fine. So, if there's a charismatic, Homo sapien who could be a good profile, that's probably the best way. Especially if there's any innovative use of funding, communication, social. If they're doing something like that's really innovative, that would be something we could cover, I think, easily.
Yeah. One thing I'd add to that is that we often get pitches for launches of such initiatives, which is not something we're inclined to cover. And so what we will do is send a note back in the rare event that we have time and say that, why don't you let us know how things are going 6 months to a year, and what has surprised you, and what's failed, and what's going well, and that might make for a more robust story.
It's like the journey.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and also I think the impacts. So if they were working on, say, mining, then you could show pictures of the mine and the communities involved and things like that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Florian Modersbacher. I work as an editor for a scientific journal. So I'm sort of neither. I'm neither a scientist nor a journalist, so totally in between the chairs. My impression from what you told us was that your view of the audience, of course, is a very demand-driven. So you have a good feeling what works, what doesn't work, what your audience likes, who your audience is, and so on and so forth. And I was wondering if you could comment a bit on to what degree you also see it as a sort of supply-driven process where, you're offering something in the hope that it set something in motion in your audience. I don't want to use the dirty word educate your audience or so, but how do you see the audience as a malleable unit in the whole communicative process? Any of you?
Yeah, I'd say, so part of it is finding the right publication with the right audience for any given story. I mean, almost every story is a story for some audience, and so like the easy way is to find the publication that serves that audience. So I used to work at Science Magazine, and I worked at Smithsonian and Slate and a bunch of other places, and now the Post. And often I'll get a pitch and I'll say, it doesn't work for me, but talk to so and so at Scientific American. It's perfect for their blog network or something like that, because it really is hard to. It's hard to do it from the supply angle. So at the Post, like we have to cover certain things. The most boring thing that'll happen at the Department of Energy, we're going to cover it. Lately, that hasn't been boring, but in the Obama administration, it was pretty boring, and we did cover it. But people don't read it. I mean, you can't make people read things. So the trick is to go where they are.
I think I sympathize very much with what I understand to be your perspective, the idea that we should be just creating stuff that we believe in, and
It's not my perspective.
No.
It's just
a question.
I wanna-
Okay, all right.
How you?
Well, it's my
how you
perspective.
guys? No, but that's what I want to hear. Yeah.
It seemed like there was a time when journalists just produced. It was just a craft where you just made the most beautiful table that you could, and you trusted that, with luck, there would be someone out there to buy it. But we can't, and in print, because you get so little information, except you get a random sampling of letters back from mostly cranks about the people who are mad enough to write it. How many letters to the editor have you written when you liked an article? I mean, there are nice people out there who do that, but it's a very random sample. You don't get a lot of information. But in digital, unfortunately, you get tremendous amount of instantaneous information about what people like, and unsurprisingly, they tend to like not necessarily the most important stuff. It's all of us doing this, and so it drives. We still do stories that we feel like we have to do, and the Post is doing a tremendous amount of great work right now on that. But we get driven to do stories that the data are telling us immediately are more wanted, and
So
that's a real tension.
So one could almost say it was really a technical development in the end of the internet and the feedbacking that shifted it.
We have too
that
much
way.
information in the world in general, I think, but I don't.
All right, thank you.
Hello, I'm Shravan. I'm from Rutgers University, and I study emerging media technologies. So last evening I was giving a talk here on citizen journalism in environment conservation, and I mentioned about a content analysis I did on 10 English national dailies in India, and to find the amount of coverage environmental issues received in the print edition, and shockingly, the highest was 0.94%, and space in the print publication. So I have a question to the panel here. I'm curious to know what future is in store for environment reporting, and whether the panel advises the researchers here to transform themselves to citizen journalists, and reach the public, and instead of trying to convince journalists to report and get these stories unnoticed and unmentioned.
Well, I guess I could start. So at Mongabay, what we've done recently is we've been expanding into other markets. So we have about 50 people in Indonesia now, about 35 cities reporting Indonesian. And last year we launched in Latin America, so Spanish-speaking market. So we're looking to expand into new markets where environmental issues are important but underserved. So our view is that environmental issues aren't going away. And politically in the United States, environmental issues are now a news story again. So there's a lot going on. In terms of citizen journalism, we're a small organization, so we don't have a lot of capacity to sort of manage citizen journalism. We found that there's a lot of issues with quality control, so it ends up being relatively expensive, even if articles are contributed, because it requires so much editing. So
my question was to do with the reporting itself from journalist side, and this question was more specific to Washington Post and the Atlantic, which has crime, politics, and other issues that eats more space on the print editions, and the issues get unnoticed. So I'm just curious to know what answer you have for the researchers here.
I mean, since we've been, and I think Rob has great reasons for resenting the rise of the internet and the sort of immediate feedback loop that it provides, and what sort of coverage that incentivizes. I think that's a valid point. However, one nice thing about the internet is that it does allow us to cover a great deal more science than certainly we would in the print Atlantic. As the person whose job it is to advocate for science stories in the print magazine at the Atlantic, I can tell you it's an uphill climb every time. We probably run 5 a year, and 2 or 3 of those are going to be maybe have a consumer health vibe. They might not even. There certainly aren't going to be conservation stories. So yes, it's difficult, but I think that's why. I mean, at the Atlantic, we look at it as that's what's so amazing about this time of digital growth is that we can bring more of the world to our readers than we can fit in an 80-page magazine 10 times a year.
And at the Post, we have, depending on how you count them, 6 or 7 or 8 reporters whose job it is to cover the environment. And we publish probably, 3 to 5, sometimes more stories a day about the environment. So we're doing the work. And we have seen since the election a big increase in interest. So we were doing the reporting, and this speaks to the earlier question about supply versus demand. So we were covering the environment very closely before the election, and there was a core set of readers who would read those stories, and they got a certain amount of traction on social media, and we're very aware of who's reading what. And the reason that this is not just because we want all the clicks, even though we do, it's to help us do our jobs better. I mean, our jobs as editors is to get the biggest possible audience for any of the stories that we handle. So we pay attention to these to know, okay, is that headline working? Is this promotional image working? Like, how can we get it out? What time of day do we want to send it out on our Facebook feed or our Twitter feed? But we've definitely seen at the Post and other places have too, that there's just much more interest, especially in climate change since the election. So that's even more motivation, and that means that we're all stepping up our games a little bit, doing even more, and there are just more angles to explore now. But there's definitely a bigger audience. So environmental journalism isn't going away. If anything, it's a really good time right now to do environmental journalism.
Thank you.
Don't be shy. Anyone want to come up and ask about anything that mystifies you about how science journalism gets made? Like, kind of what were they thinking? These are literally 4 of the top minds in all of science journalism. Sure, let's start here.
Is there any hope for positive stuff to be actively reported, which is kind of what it was talking about in the blurb there? I noticed particularly your comment about outrage is great, and yet this whole summit is about hell doesn't sell. So hell does sell still.
Sells, yeah.
How do people pitch information to make it interesting enough to say, there's actually a lot of good things going on?
No one wants to speak for Optimism.
No, we all do.
Well, I
You
mean,
think we don't like good news stories? Is that?
Yeah.
I feel like we're totally open to that. I mean, it's, I guess, yeah. I almost.
Can I mention?
I mean, the last big environment story I wrote was about Germany's energy transition, and it was a completely hopeful one, saying, "Look, they're doing it. It's a big industrial country like us. Why can't we do that?" And I mean, it was. I'm always looking for stuff like that, and I don't think that's specific to National Geographic. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I did a poor job of communicating earlier that's with my fancy Anthropocene language, but that's part of what I mean by us being in this new era where we are actively trying to wrestle with conservation issues in a way that isn't just sort of pointing out, the big bag villains, but actually tries to ask what it might mean to live alongside, say, large predators or something like that. That story in particular was a good news story of sorts. It was about an improving problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that Ross said it very well in his presentation. I know, I wrestle with the idea of something like Earth optimism as well, because our job is to tell it as it is and as we see it and tell the narratives that we find to be true. But if there's a glimmer of hope and that's authentic and there's a real solution there that's relevant, we want to include that. We're not going for the worst news possible, but we're also not a press team. We're trying to cover the world as it is, not just as we want it to be. And we don't want to put out a false image of what the world is like either. So yeah, when I look for stories, I am conscious of everyone's trying to sell me something. They're trying to sell this as the next best technology that's going to save the world. If so, I want to know all the complexities and the caveats and people that don't believe that and what their argument is. I want to show all sides. So.
Yeah, and journalism has a lot of kind of formulas. There's a profile formula. There's the top 10 formula. There's just a lot of things that you see over and over again. And one of the formulas is what works. So a what works story, those tend to be popular. They're satisfying. It's really great when a problem's identified, a solution. Especially if there's people doing clever or heroic things, people really enjoy those, and we enjoy them too. They're a little bit harder to find, unfortunately.
I was actually at Wired before, and I just remembered that that's the most optimistic magazine I could ever imagine. Every issue is like, we're going to have flying cars in 10 years, guys. We'll have them. We literally have like a 1989 issue that says we'll have flying cars soon. And like that's what they sell. That's their tone. If you want that kind of magazine to profile you, then you give them the technology that you think will save the world. But that gets old to other people. Like, you don't expect flying cars to save the world. If you've read Wired enough, you know that that's not going to happen. So we can't just oversell everything either.
Yeah, hi, my name's Linda Staley, and I used to be a news junkie and read the paper a lot, but I've just gotten so depressed, frankly. And so while I want to read the Washington Post, which is what I typically read in the morning, I've been having this fantasy of writing to the Post and saying, can you just have a section of your paper tell about like best practices and good news stories? And I could go there first every morning just to cheer myself up. And I'm like, why can't all these news outlets have a good news story section where you go and you read about optimism and best practices? And it's like, I don't get why that doesn't happen.
So we do actually.
And oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, sign up for we have a newsletter called The Optimist.
Yeah.
Okay. That collects all of our good news stories.
But
yeah,
why
you'll
not
love
in
it.
the actual hard copy of the Post?
Oh, so sorry, the newsletter, and I don't mean to interrupt your question. But so it's a newsletter that collects all the different happy stories.
Okay.
So most of them were in print. Sometimes they're just online versus print. That all depends on like how long it is and things like that.
But maybe you could suggest to your paper that like you have the kids post, just happy news post, in the style section or something, that would cheer us up and make us want to read the paper every morning. And the second thing is I'm here to try to pitch a story, so I'm not going to do it right now. I know I can't, but young people are really amazing, and I find sometimes that the news folks don't want to really hear stories about what young people are doing because it's not part of the hard news, or it goes over in kids post and it gets sort of there's silos, right? So I just am curious about how you look at those kind of stories, and whether that's something that you value.
I hate children. No, just kidding. We're super interested in millennials. I actually don't know whether that's good or bad, but like I recently did a story on, is hashtagging your environment enough to save it, with a little hashtag? And it was about how conservationists are using location-based data from Instagram posts and Flickr posts to say people are engaging with this environment. They really like this vista. Can we allocate more resources to it? The problem is it's a popularity contest, and you'll continue to support this beautiful like mountain overlook where everyone takes selfies that's not necessarily productive ecologically. So we looked at both the pros and cons and put it in a section, Future of Conservation. It's about things that are working, could be working, and so I would consider that to be somewhat optimistic, but also looking at all sides of it. Anyways, we're fascinated with millennials.
It interests me the language that journalists use in talking about stories and things of that sort. Several of you used the word framing. Why would you use framing instead of just the old-fashioned word context? And do you talk about framing all day, every day? And tell us about framing, please.
I guess I would think of context and framing as being two distinct things. Context is sort of theoretically the opposite things, really. Like context is infinite. Every story can go back to the Big Bang if conceived in a certain way. And that's why we need framing. We need to say, where does this story start? Where does it end? Who are the characters in it? What are the ideas that are important? What are the forces in the world that are acting on it? And what should we exclude? Because particularly on features and magazine features, when you send someone on sort of and you all know as being researchers, on a sort of 6 to 8 month quest to learn everything about a subject, they come back with potentially hundreds of thousands of words, and so we have to figure out what is the framing that captures the essence of those many hundreds of thousands of words in sort of the smallest package.
And one of the problems that journalists face all the time is that every field has its own jargon, but this is very meta because journalism has its own jargon. And so we use framing, it's journalism jargon, but we use it slightly differently than the political scientists do. So they use framing as a way of intentionally manipulating a political argument to make people agree with your point of view and vote the way you want them to vote. But in journalism, we meet it a little bit different, which is just, as he said, which is just the story. Like, where does the story begin and end? And that's often that's one of the hardest things to find in a science or environment or conservation story is what is a satisfying conclusion narratively, because the answer is always, well, we need more research, or time will tell. So that's one of the tricks. If you're ever involved or know about a research project that suddenly has an answer, or there's like a kind of a conclusion is coalescing, people are finally, after a long debate, kind of coming to understand something in a way they didn't before, that can be a really good time. That's not necessarily news driven, but it can be a really good time for people to bring up a field, a line of research that deserves attention, and because that's very satisfying when a field that has a lot of questions have been answered. And so that's a kind of way that we use framing.
I came in late, so I'm not sure if this was covered already, but just wondering about how, with the falsehoods that we're hearing constantly, how do we deal with that? How do we expose the fake news from the other side? It's alarming, obviously. I mean, blatant lies are coming out all the time. So I'm just curious about that. And I guess part two would be, in the context of climate change, again, where is the inroad to finally sort of, get the point across, to those that are consistently pushing back on that it's in fact real?
So how do you deal with news that isn't real and news that is politicized and?
Yeah, because it just feels like an onslaught of, fakery every day.
I don't have the answer on the first question on the how do we deal with fake news, but the second one, I think it's going to be a generational thing. I mean, look, 195 countries have 197, I don't know. All the countries in the world have agreed to do something about climate change. So we have some outliers like North Korea and maybe the United States soon, but they can't last. It's like the plate tectonics revolution. How did it happen that when I was in college, there were plate tectonics had already happened, but I still got turned off of geology by one of the guys who didn't believe it yet, so he didn't teach it. But those people die. And then pretty soon, no one doubts plate tectonics anymore. And it's going to be that way with climate change. The question is it going to be soon enough? It's not. It matters more than if you don't believe in plate tectonics. Who cares? But that's it'll happen. I think soon. I think we're in a bubble. Is that true?
I think so. Yeah. And I was going to speak to the first question about the fake news. So journalists are getting better at calling a lie a lie. It was hard to prepare for the onslaught that we've been seeing. But this is something that basically everybody should consider themselves deputized to fight. And partly because a lot of the misinformation and fake news, viral news, spreads through social media. So you have a lot of power within your social networks to call a lie, and also to bring forth news magazine, any TV articles that are accurate, like to share those widely, to challenge people who because there's just like something sick about human psychology that if somebody we know tells it to us, we believe it, even if they're full of baloney. So it's kind of something that journalists can do somewhat. Google is doing somewhat. Fact checkers. There's a lot of technological ways to highlight Snopes debunkings, highlight fact checks, things like that. But it really is something that everybody should try to do and everybody should try to fight.
So Laura made great points there. I think one thing that was illustrated really well by Randy Olson yesterday in his talk was the importance of narrative. So facts alone won't carry the story. If you've got a great narrative, then people will listen to that. So I mean, this is on us as journalists, is figuring out, well, it's also on scientists to figure out like what the story is. So what we really need are fact-driven narratives. So, because if we just do facts, it's not enough right now. So you have to produce stories that will carry with people.
Cool. That is perfect amount of time. Thank you guys so much for being part of the solution here and for opening lines of communication and being interested in this. And let's please give these incredible speakers a round of applause. Thanks.